Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Meredith Nini, and on behalf of the University of Chicago Press, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this event in celebration of National Poetry Month. Today, we present a reading and conversation between Charles Bernstein, author of Topsy-Turvy, and author of Radium of the Word, a Poetics of Materiality. This event is presented in collaboration with Seminary Co-op Bookstore and as part of our virtual event series, By the Book, Smart Talk with Chicago Authors. This series aims to bring big ideas and smart conversation directly to you. We have plenty of great talks coming up, and I'll include a link to the event schedule in the chat. This evening's event will be 1 hour long, and we will have time for a question and answer period at the end of the session. So please plan to submit your questions in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to all the questions. And as a courtesy, if you could please keep yourself muted throughout the discussion so we can reduce any background noise. So I'll introduce our guests. Charles Bernstein is the Donald T. Reagan Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Pennsylvania and a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is the author of Pitch of Poetry, Recalculating, and Near Miss, all published by the University of Chicago Press. In 2019, he was awarded the Bollingen Prize for Poetry from Yale University, the highest American honor for lifetime achievement in poetry. Today, Charles will be reading from his newest poetry collection, Topsy-Turvy. We're also joined by Craig Dworkin, Professor of English at the University of Utah. He is the author of Reading the Illegible, No Medium, and Dictionary Poetics, as well as 10 books of poetry, including the Pinewoods Notebook. Today, he'll be discussing Radium of the Word, a Poetics of Materiality, which was released from the University of Chicago Press in 2020. As a final reminder, both books are available for purchase now. I'll be posting links in the chat so you can find the books through the Seminary Co-op. If you're interested in purchasing ebooks, you can do so from the press website. And in the case of Topsy-Turvy, we also have an audiobook version coming very soon, which is read by the author. So thanks so much for joining us. I will now turn the discussion over to our guests.
Well, thank you, Meredith. And I think I could speak for Craig too, that it's so great to be published by the University of Chicago Press. And I want to thank everyone there and you for all the work you've done in helping to promote the book. And also my favorite bookstore, Sem Co-op Books, or Seminary Co-op Books. When I first went in there, it was actually in a cathedral. It's one of the few things, a bookstore, which I think is a holy place that should be in a cathedral. Now they're in a regular but very nice store, but it's such a great place. And I think we all realize how important supporting independent bookstores is and getting books through independent bookstores. And I've even contributed to them because they actually do, they're a nonprofit to keep them in business, especially when they were closed for so long. So, and it's great to be here with Craig, whose book I love. Hey, Craig.
Hey, Charles. It's really good to talk to you.
I'm going to start by reading my blurb for the book. Because of the way I have this background, you can't really see that I'm holding the book, but you can see a picture of the book in the back. And here is my blurb, so it's a good way to start off. Of course, if it was Craig, you probably I should read somebody else's blurbs, but that would probably be more, but I'm going to read my own. Dworkin is the closest reader we have. In startling, revelatory, and delightful essays on an astonishing range of writers and artists, Dworkin resists the systematic and canonical in pursuit of the peculiar, specific, and particular. Radium of the Word proposes a radically new approach to reading poetry, focusing on textual features that are not necessarily intentional. This book will be of importance to scholars of modernist and avant-garde literature, post-war African-American poetry, and anyone interested in contemporary poetics. Now, if I was reading that and hadn't written it, I would complain about this formulation, the closest reader we have, which generally I hate. Who is we? But somehow for a blurb, it's we have. It's a I guess a term of art. So I mean, maybe we could start out with my question to you that you won't be surprised about. What was the original title for this book? I read the manuscript, of course, because I wrote the blurb based on the manuscript, and you had a different title.
Yeah, I mean, let me first say that I also wanted to have a little frontispiece warning saying that readings in this book are closer than they appear. But we took that out to make it look more professional.
That's my kind of, I like that. I do that I have a number of things in my book that are like that.
The original, there are actually two titles behind this one. The original one I was remembering earlier today was Misreading a User's Manual. But everyone then thought it was going to be about Harold Bloom.
Harold who? Harold.
That's what I kept saying. So I had to.
It's a Jewish guy. He taught at in
some school
Johns
in
Hopkins,
somewhere like that. Yeah.
I'm resisting my strong predecessor with my Miss Prison. It's an Oedipal thing between Bloom and me. I'm sorry.
But then my next working title was My Dear Degas. From a, should I tell the story?
Definitely.
It's a great story. It's one of my favorite stories. The painter Degas is talking to his friend Stéphane Mallarmé, the poet, and Degas is complaining about poetry, and it's a lot of work, he says, and it's not going very well for Degas, who's a great painter but is having trouble writing poems. He says, I have all these great ideas for poems, but then I go to actually write them and they don't work out. And Mallarmé says, my dear Degas, poems are made of words, not ideas. But then everyone.
But he says that in French, I'm sure.
He did say it in French. Cher Degas. It's a matter of words, des mots. But everyone in Chicago worried that this was going to get mistaken for an art book in which I then don't actually have any pictures from Degas, and people would be disappointed. So we changed it to the last line of a great Mina Loy poem, a poem portrait of Gertrude Stein, whom Loy refers to as Curie, Madame Curie of the laboratory of vocabulary. She crushed the tonnage of consciousness, congealed to phrases to extract a radium of the word.
But now, I believe she had some problem. Didn't she have some problem with radium there, that Madame Curie? Wasn't that like what, radium poisoning? Is that part of, or that's not your kind of reading? That's too psychological. My kind of reading is the fact that Loy, when she was asked to fill out a questionnaire about what she most looked forward to in the future, was she was most looking forward to the splitting of atoms. But isn't, after all, radium is a kind of dangerous thing if you're exposed to it. You don't want to get too close. So there it is. All right. There it is. But it must be in there somewhere. Well, as it happens in Topsy-Turvy, I have a poem. Do you know about this? I bet you do. I think I came across this. That relates to this, and I would like to read it for you. It's called Ars Impotens. Let me set that up, and so I can read the poem in its proper light here for you. I'm backward. Topsy-turvy. I'm topsy-turvy. Oh my God. Poetry is made not of ideas, but of words. Poetry is not made of ideas, but words. Poetry's made not of ideas, but of words. Of words, poetry's made, not ideas. Words is what poetry is made of, not ideas. Not of ideas. Poetry's made of words, is made of words, poetry, not ideas. Made not of ideas, but words, poetry.
Charles, can you say something about the title?
Yeah, I could, but I don't really know what to say about it. I was thinking of that. Ars impotens. But you're the close reader. What do you think it could mean?
I was wondering if you might be thinking
with you, I don't have to answer a question like that. How do I know what it means? It just occurred to me.
I thought that the poetry being made of things, and poetry from the Greek for making with the hands, making being all to the point that you might be thinking of Auden's poem in memory of Yeats, that poetry makes. It's double making, but it makes
poetry makes nothing happen, which I always like to say.
Impotent.
Right. Well, poetry allows nothing to happen, allows nothing to.
It makes a nothingness.
It's a kind of non-instrumental. I think that's probably. I'm going to accept that reading, except impotens. First of all, what is that, Latin or something? There's a strange Latin thing going through the whole book, and I guess it's ars poetico. It's another poem in there. Impotent art. That art doesn't do anything. It is. A poem should not, whatever, be but boomerang. Now, that poem is, of course, influenced by a number of things. For one, I mean, you mentioned, because you discussed this in your book, the famous quote from William Carlos Williams, a poem is a small or large machine made of words. So this is certainly part of what you were interested in and what that would mean. And I think actually that's quite relevant to your take on reading, to look at the procedures that go into making a poem and not the message that could be separated. And I want to talk more about that. Another poem, which I'm sure you're quite aware, it echoes, is Louis Zukofsky's Julia's Wild, which of course is cut up from Shakespeare, a permutation from Shakespeare. Come, shadow, come and take this shadow up. Come, shadow, shadow, come and take this up. Come, shadow, come and take this shadow. So he goes on for a number of lines, making those kinds of permutations. So here's my question for you based on that. What is, if it's anything, the materiality of the word? What is the material of the word? And here's my related question, which goes back to talk about, no ideas but in things. You have a book from MIT Press, No Medium. So what I could also ask in a similar way, what is the medium of poetry? What is the materiality and what is the medium? So these are my questions for you.
I have a similar answer for both of them, which is the materiality for me is the kind of the horizon, or the limit at which one mode of interpretation has to stop, and some other kind of processing or analysis or understanding or interpretation has to start to take over. To go back to the Creeley line that you get form and content in a kind of dynamic relationship with each other. I think materiality and message or something like that, or in a similar relationship. It's not that they're different, but as soon as you get to one, it flips over into the other, and some other horizon of the material starts to recede. And when you get up to that, you have to start thinking in a different way to make sense, to have things signify at all.
So continuing on to that, and on the approach that you take to reading, as I said in my blurb, and it's something we've often talked about, and it's, I mean, the term close reading is sometimes applied to your work, but not actually with much connection to close listening as in its literary historical terms, in American criticism, the well-wrought urn. In fact, your approach is antipathetic to that. And that's what I want to ask you about. Even though you're using the term close, you're reading close and you're reading, but it's not close reading in that sense, because you're kind of against interpretation. Although there was a famous book by that name, wasn't there?
I couldn't use that title either. I know. It's just
but well, I also think, and I saw his name float up a bit. There, Paul Beauvais and I have been corresponding a lot recently about his book Love Shadow, and that book, one of the many things that it takes up is the problem with the way in which within the literary academy everything is allegorized, everything is transmuted to mean something else. Allegoresis, he calls it. And it seemed to me that your approach is actually, extremely committed to resisting this kind of constant that something means something else. What's the message, or even what's the message of the form? As if there's some kind of something that can be something that's being done apart from what the poem is doing, that you can extract and say that this is what it's about. This is why this is happening. So it's really about, for example, as many poems are, and I use this as an example not to squirm out of it, it's really about grief or death of a particular person in the life of, and of course a poem may well be that, but that could also remove the poem from being what it is. I mean, one problem I have with that in framing in my books is that it isn't necessarily about what happened to you outside of the book. It's what's happening to you as the reader when you're reading the book. So you could say, well, yes, there could be something that happened politically. There was a war, there was a death, there was this and that, but that isn't what the experience of the poem is, or what I would want the poem to be as a performance, as something that's enacted when you read it. And then there are things that happen. So, what I wanted you to talk about is this, what exactly is your resistance to what's behind the poem, what's an interiority against a conventional sense of understanding and perhaps of interpretation. And at one point I said to you, although it's not so much apparent in this book, but it was apparent, especially with something a couple of different essays you wrote that were not in there. You would describe certain features in a poem that you saw going on that were irrefutable, and yet they seemed to have nothing at all to do with what the poem was about, or even that the poet was aware of it was something that was not of interest to you. And I said to you at that time, but you don't do that final step of envisioning how this actually relates to what we might think of as the poem in the new critical sense, what the poem means, what its interpretation is. You just say, this weird stuff happens. Well, I mean, you talk about this in respect to Oppen, that's one, but you have others that you talk about. There are things that are just features of the text itself that are apparent. It's almost like the text itself is taking over, and the author is just one part of that. So what about this, resistance to interpretation?
I think another word instead of close might be that I'm a very literal reader, and I've trouble. I'm not even sure that I'm not sure that I believe that there is such a thing as figural language. Even I think that may be a false distinction. One of the things I love about the Mallarmé quip is that he makes a point about literalism by being literal. And I think that that'd be another way to describe that horizon of interpretive switches or modes of reading that have to take place when one runs up against the material, that being too distracted by language as the communicative medium that it is, that by as a symbolic system, which it is, makes it hard to see the other things that are going on. And this is a book that started back with those other titles decades ago, and was sort of stalled and suspended because I couldn't answer your question. What is going on psychologically? What is going on with the author? And because I couldn't answer that, only because I decided not how I learned to stop worrying about psychology and love the poem, was I able to finish this book by not even beginning to answer this question that I could never answer. All I can say is that yes, that these things are going on in the text. How they got there is someone else's theological problem.
I mean, you were speaking to something that many of us were interested in the 70s, and there was a kind of resistance to, it was before I was teaching too. So teaching changed a lot for me, but when I wasn't teaching, just reading, the idea that you'd say anything about the poem seemed somehow a problem. What would you say? Just you would write another poem. I don't think that, and I didn't really think that exactly at the time, but still there was an enormous resistance to the conventional review and to the interpretation by some super mode, and every whatever X number of years they dominate. And those of us who teach literature, can't completely put that out, because it really is a very hegemonic interpretive strategies that they're competing, but one takes over, and then everything you read cites, one of 15 names, and then 10 years later it's a different 15 names, but everything is supposed to be as Bloom was for a time. So Bloom would stand for that. It was a misprisoning and so on. And now, and those things easily go out of fashion too, but I mean, there's a lot of great literary criticism that's done within those modes. And you could even say, though I certainly wouldn't say it, and don't it, close your ears, that you and me, who have a lot in common, we may also just be putting forward, a modality like everybody else. And one of my modalities is to kind of question the modality of the reading, or the hegemony of a particular interpretation. But that itself, of course, I well understand is a style and has a specific historical context. You mentioned in your conversation recently with Michael Nardone, excellent conversation, soon to be on, that Michael Fried, who was somebody very important to me. And I do think it relates to, I have a lot of, many of us, where somebody writes about Smithson, who he couldn't really make any sense of. But nonetheless, you mentioned how significant it was. And I think it's because of this, because Fried would simply read a painting in respect to internal formal issues, although the historicism is actually, you're not even interested in that historical sweep. So he does have his movement toward abstraction that he's looking for so that itself pulls you away from what's going on. But you're reluctant to even go that far, although of course in the end you always, interpretation jumps out at you even in the absence of your giving what that interpretation is.
Right. I mean, and Fried is a good example in his reading of Stephen Crane, as he starts to see pairs of words that begin with the letters S and the letter C. If you're too concerned with the symbolic language, you're not noticing the letters that words begin with, and then he starts to see the sinuosity of figures. I mean, Fried always folds it back into the narrative the narrative scene. There's a snake in the grass that is curved like the S, that is like the S of Stephen, and so on.
Right. And that's what you don't do.
That's too much.
But that's a good example. And of course, McGann's wonderful Black Riders
Black
does
Riders
something different, because Black Riders is what you're talking about. I think the actual printing, the physical printing, and the cap letters in the book, The Black Riders, which it's hard to know what Stephen Crane thought about that. I mean, he obviously wanted to have some different design, but you know what it meant. But for us, it means that it's the mark of printing. Well, one place which you do a great job of dealing with this content is your chapter on Russell Atkins. In respect, you could say, to the relation of abstraction to figuration in poetry, to take it to a more concrete level, because figuration is a different issue versus abstraction, whatever that might be in verbal language. I tend to think that there's never non-referentiality, except as it moves to becomes music. But you really deal with that toggling. Maybe we talk about, and could put on the screen, one of Atkins' poems, because this is really what you do. Look at a poem and
yeah,
and
Charles, are you up for reading this?
Yeah, you know, it's of course it's I read it with some reluctance, but I am going to do it. I think of, first of all, I want to acknowledge this wonderful book of Atkins, the collected poems that was published. So it's really worth getting. I know you were very involved in having that book come out, and that's a revelation. And I know you have been very involved with Atkins for years, and have his work, the original publications, on the Eclipse site. So in a moment, you can talk a little bit about it. But I would say, before I read this, that I think of Janice Lowe and Julie Patton, who are both from Cleveland and who are fantastic performers. Julie does fantastic performances, and you know, perhaps the two poets that I know are most closely connected, in addition to you, with Atkins. And the recognition of the relation of this, which you talk about, to self-possession. I hear voices coming over by an unmuted mic, which I like very
spiritual.
Much. I'm hearing the voices, the spirits coming through to me. There's the famous, you know, Didn't It Rain, right? Because even before I read it, it's in your book, but it's it is either the slave song or possibly the gospel song, in case of spiritual, which is the story. I mean, some in the audience will know it. It's a Jewish thing. With Noah, got commanded to destroy the world through a flood, right? And a pestilence, let's call it a pandemic, and to start out over. And it's not a very happy story, but anyway, it's been picked up by many other groups. And this is an example. Didn't It Rain is in the song, boy, it rained. That's what Didn't It Rain mean. So I also think, of course, and you also mentioned of Apollinaire, Il pleut, which means it rains, one of the most iconic visual poems. So I'm mentioning this, even though this is what you talk about, but I'm echoing back what you say, because I'm thinking about, when you asked me to read it, which you did, these are the thoughts that came through my mind, and I don't just want to read it without mentioning that first. So the problem of the potential unperformability of this is also interesting to me, because it could be that the poem shouldn't be performed. We don't have any record, as far as I know, of it ever being performed. It may just be that it's marks on the paper. But so what would it be like? And yet there's a rich tradition of performing things like this. And but yet to give it its historical specificity and to deal with the way in which it's not a song, but works against the rhythmic aspects of it. So I think something like this might work. Spiritual. Oh, didn't it? Rain. Oh, did it rain?
Jost, let me come back and ask ask you a question. The Apollinaire makes me think of, and this comes from, I'm thinking of teaching also, and one of the things that has really changed with my students over the last decade or so are sort of celebrity modernist references. So I'm gonna have a seminar on Gertrude Stein in which only one person had ever heard of Gertrude Stein before.
And remind me again of who she is.
She was she was the Madame Curie of language. My seminar,
but she is actually, of course, she crosses over into popular culture, so
well,
people are likely
she used to. I could used to count on people knowing the name, knowing a line, and now not anymore. Only one of my students this term had heard of Allen Ginsberg or Howell, and so I'm curious, given how many allusions, tropings, quotations are in Topsy-Turvy, an endless list from Milton, Rimbaud, Williams, on and on. How important those are for your imagined readers?
It's a question I appreciate. On the Atkins, which we'll come back to before leaving completely, but let me take it from there. It used to be said that at least one thing that people would know about would be the Bible, Exodus, right? I mean, if you had a reference to the Bible, people would know it. But in my experience, that really wasn't true. I remember teaching God's Trombone once, the wonderful James Weldon Johnson version of the Genesis of the Old Testament, and one of the students, who was African, great kid, I think it was the creation. It was the very first thing. I just love this story. He said to me, came over after, it was actually a big class. We were in the Kelly Writer's house, and he said he just loved the story. I said, yeah, fantastic version of Genesis. He said, yeah, what is that? It was the first time he had heard Genesis. I thought, wow, but it is a great story. You know, when people hear about things, it's not linear and not Euclidean. And I just assume that people know some things and don't know others. I mean, I do appreciate a kind of reading such as you might do, or other people, where they recognize the sources. Like, for example, I wouldn't expect people to know the Zukowski source of the, or even, I don't even mention, the Mallarmé in that poem. There's no note to that effect. And yet I would expect that you would know that. And yet I wouldn't put it as a note, because, and I notice a lot of people do put a lot of notes in because they want to be responsible. They don't want to seem like they're taking stuff without acknowledging what it is. But my feeling is that I don't want to encumber the reader with a lot of things that they think they need to know to read the poem, because the poems are all inductive, they're front loaded. So you read it and you have that experience. And maybe if you don't know that quote from Mallarmé, you'd be like that student here in the James Weldon Johnson. You say, well, that's a really interesting, and that's fine. I want to take credit for it, but I do think that's the part you want to get into that experience. You once wrote along, not, I think you probably wrote it, but you were saying about, for example, interesting example for me with you. I had one of the first poems that I published from 1975 was called Asylum, was all taken from Irving Goffman's book of that name. Now, the name of the book and the name of the poem is Asylum. It would seem like if you read it, it was a cut up taken from that book. But there's no indication in the book that that's what it's from. And you commented on, I think you thought maybe if you were doing something like that, you would have said, and it was published 40 copies, Xerox. I spoke to the people who I gave it to, so I didn't really think about it in that way. When I did publish it in my selected poems, I did indicate in the back what the source was. And even online, I have the actual full version of Goffman's book with where it comes from. So I'm not against it. But you were noticing that, at least among my circle of friends, that we tended to not put information in that you thought maybe you would have, not that we should have, but that could be put in. So I don't know if I'm sort of throwing it back to you, but to what degree do you think things need to be acknowledged by the poet in the book?
Yeah, no, I have no sense of should, but it does strike me as
should never say should. That's my motto, Should
really
you?
Striking change in how people talk about and present and frame their poems from, that moment in the late 70s to today, where it would just be the first thing anyone would say about their poem is, this is an appropriation of a line by Mallarmé. It's part of how they're introduced and talked about. I think my favorite from Topsy-Turvy, I think my favorite echo is the hazel grounds of unperturbed timeliness, as an echo of dim lands of peace, which Pound said, don't use such an expression, and you use it and then you don't, and then
right. And I don't give in my particular case, because it's what I call echo poetics, it's all a tissue of echoes and allusions, and where I would start and where I would stop, I wouldn't know. And I don't want to have that experience of having all the sources. It's not about identifying the sources. It's about the experience you have listening to the echoes and the refraction. At the same time, they are very literary works. They do have those elements, and it is possible for someone who writes about it to write about what the sources are. And I find that very interesting too. And I appreciate when somebody does that. So I don't really mind. I don't think you can give too much information about a poem if you're reading it, or that you can or even that you can overread. All those things seem good, but in presenting the poem as a performance. So let's go back for one more second, because I'm also looking at the time. We want to read one poem, and then we want to open it up for the questions for the last few minutes. Maybe say something about what you say about that Atkins poem in respect to what we're talking about, because I don't want to completely abandon the close reading of that poem that you give. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that poem.
Yeah, what strikes me as important about this poem is the cultural context and this would be part of its materiality, in which the print circulates hand to hand, in particular bookshops. And I mean, the reading that I won't rehearse it here, because I do want to move on to things, but that in the context of Cleveland a particular moment, I find the allusions to be starkly and emphatically political, and to be speaking to questions of police brutality and murder, of racial inequities, economic inequities, but it's also a poem that's circulated in small mimeo journals of concrete and visual poetry, and so there's a lot going on in the quotation marks, but that social context in which texts, printed texts, spoken texts, are exchanged, is for me part of one of those horizons at which the kind of reading we do needs to get shunted to another track if it's going to go any further.
What year do you think this poem was written?
This is a poem. I think I've got the title page here, which I
Well,
love.
there's the you have
blue.
actual. This is the Eclipse version. 66.
It's beautiful blue ink. 1960, the summer of 1966.
So the conventional, not the conventional, the historical reading, 1966, and what that had to do with the Black Power, emergent Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, and very importantly, as those who know the reference fully, which isn't given here, it's no more water, but the fire next time. Fire next time again. Somebody might not know what that is because I think it's a biblical reference, but it also is a book by James Baldwin. So there we get into, do you know who James Baldwin is? When did he write that book? What does the fire next time mean? If you remember the fire next time, but both the Noah story as well as why Baldwin uses it, well then, it takes on it rains, but the next is going to be, worse. It's going to burn. It's going to burn, right? So it's and then also I think that if you think of those marks as being scat, I didn't do it that way because I wanted to avoid it then, and maybe more in the way that say a Baraka might read, then it would be didn't it boom 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 didn't it boom didn't it rain, it's going to rain, but it isn't that. That's why it isn't that we have an understanding of how scat would work in that context. Atkins is on the record as being against appropriating the poem for a message, right? He's in tune with you, and yet it's hard not to see this poem as very political, searingly political in its intervention into poetry, into concrete visual poetry, into sound poetry, into the discourse of the slave song and the singing and the gospel music, and into Black consciousness, into white consciousness, so into a revolution of thought, and I think spiritual is quite serious in the title.
No, I think so too. Maybe thinking of the context for poems and the context in which language gets exchanged and allusion, and while I've got screen sharing up,
okay.
I wonder if you wanted to read the boat ride on Westlake.
Okay, so let me go through the pictures, and actually, why don't you keep these pictures up while I read the poem, because I think it'll just be quicker. This is Westlake. Westlake is in Hangzhou, one of the most beautiful places in China. And it's, you'll know it if you've seen Chinese landscape painting, especially for those echoes of the mountains, so the way they echo in the back. So this is a picture I took. It's an iPhone snapshot, but it gives you some sense of people riding the boats and the what's considered within China, and for those who honor the art coming out of it, the most beautiful pastoral site. Then the next slide, please. This is the other, if you look the other way, you see downtown Hangzhou. So this is what the poem is about. If you're looking back, one side you have that view. And then finally, just to, this is me with my great friend, Luo Lianggang, who's brought me, one of my main friends in China, who's a scholar, by the way, of African-American poetry. That's his field. So let's go back. You can go back to the toggle between the two, but we'll keep the first slide. So this poem was written because I was asked by Professor Nia, who's my other associate there, the head of the Chinese American Association for Poetry and Poetics, to write a poem. He said this is a genre in China, and would I write a poem about Westlake? So it fits into many other poems about Westlake. And it's called Boat Ride on Westlake, Pastoral. I can swim better than talk, and walking's just the same if I remember how. Swim against tide, tire quicker, I do. Or when you let tide rule and you're pulled under, the echo of the mountains on the lake, just like for oodles of years, but at your back. The lake is bound by Metro Anywhere. It's local v universal, to belabor the shibboleth. A few blocks away, shirts blowing on tenement line, just like the home I thought I imagined. No one will believe this is of vast import to the nation.
Thank you.
So do you have any thoughts about that?
I think there might be an allusion towards the end, but I think maybe I'll leave it unread. But it does have to do with pastoral.
Well, it's the William Carlos Williams poem Pastoral. No one will believe that this is a vast import to the nation. But you're right. Let's move on. This is so typical of you in a way, because you let's just let it. We don't even need to say that, because I don't say it in the book after all. But here I am being asked, and I'm not even asked. I'm happy to mention its connection to the William Carlos Williams poem. But in a way, I'm reenacting the William Carlos Williams poem, and there's a lot of differences. And I love that Williams poem, but I wouldn't want to think you need to read the Williams poem to hear that poem, And yet, if you do, that's the echo poetics that I'm interested in, and
I know Meredith is going to move things over to questions, but I also just want to say that it as you said, things aren't linear and reading's not linear, and it goes both ways. And your Boat Ride on Westlake actually helps illuminate my reading of the Williams. It's not that the allusions only go one direction.
Well, and it's also my in a way, it's about literary. It's also my reading of Williams. It's my thinking through Williams within a non-national space, because there's a lot you could say about that. That's why I wanted you to see the picture of me in the boat with my friends as a tourist. What is it to be, when that becomes a kind of postcard, and everybody, if you're around that lake, thousands of pictures are taken every hour. Everybody's taking pictures with one view, not the view I'm talking about. And what happens when you put it in a non-national context? It's not American. Pastoral is a very American poem. It's very much about American cities. It has a lot to do with what Biden said in his speech last night. And in fact, Biden, when he spoke last night, is really saying that no one will believe it's a great import. He's saying that, the condition of the poor and how we make this culture from the bottom up, not trickle down. That's a Williams sentiment, not said in the way Obama might, but that's what it is, that one wants to look at what's going on in an area of very poor people. That's Williams's frame when I went to see the houses of the very poor. So, that's the background, but this is not the US, this is China, and it's actually prosperous downtown. So yes, I guess we go to questions. Is that right, Meredith?
That's right. So if the audience has questions, they can submit them in the chat and we'll take it from there.
Well, and perhaps in the absence of questions, people may be Zoom questioned out. My thinking, I know when they say in teaching that you're supposed to leave space for people who haven't spoken to speak, I tend to go for like 3 to 5 seconds of silence. I'm not, I've been with Craig. He'll go for a while, 5 minutes and not say anything. I've never gone more than like 15 to 20 seconds with that. That's the max amount of silence I can tolerate.
I like to go 4 minutes and 33 seconds exactly, and then speak.
Okay.
Well, while people are thinking, Charles, maybe I'm going to ask as one more question that I wanted to ask. Thinking about the echoes and the echo logs, where the first line of the first one, which begins to all's high, guys, everything that echoes. I have a reading, as you know, I have a reading of that first line in relation to the Latin. But I wondered about the everything there. The everything that echoes. If there are parts of this for you that don't echo, or if it's everything echoes, or this is everything that echoes in distinction to everything that does not echo.
Well, for one thing, the great thing about translation is that it's a scrim or a frame for projection. So I don't have to figure out what I think something means. I can use the excuse of, or the experience of, trying to translate and in being in dialogue with Virgil's Latin. So, I mean, obviously to all's high, guys, is a more traditional translation would be the gods, Zeus, the gods on high, who control everything. But what I want to do here is to make it into a more vernacular and to try to think about it has a lot to do with what we've been talking about. If you read, there is a book that I published called Ecologues, a little pamphlet, which is available, which I know you've seen, where I give all the Dryden and many other translations of each of the lines, plus the Latin. And here in this version, you're just seeing the English, but I wanted to have an experience in the English that didn't have the archaicness and the encumbrance of having to look up who a god was, or that it sounded like it was, or what the ritual was, or whatever would block our present experience of it. So here's an example of something that's almost always comes with a lot of historical baggage, and I admire scholars who enabled me to do this translation, who give me that information. But having had it and having many other translations, I wanted to create an immediacy. So maybe, high, of course, has a drug culture or alcohol inebriated, but that, of course, it ends up being close to what Virgil is doing too. And Eclogues is itself a pastoral. So, and yet his pastorals are much more urban than I think a lot of times a lot of people are, certainly the way I imagine them to be. When you read them, they're more like Catullus. They're very sexually explicit. They're very cosmopolitan, as a term I like. So everything that echoes, I also think of what echoes there. All the hills echo it from Blake. I want to create, everything doesn't echo, if that's your question. Of course not. I want to create an experience in the book, Topsy-Turvy, even though upside down, that everything echoes within the book, to create an echo chamber in the book. But of course, the harsh reality that you smash against, and I come up in this many times in the book, is that things don't echo, and that one can't rely on echo and resonance for truth or for justice. So in this way, I'm against empathy in the sense that what we really need is civil liberties and rights and protection against for those who don't have empathy for us, or for those we don't have empathy toward. So it's not that you need people to like you or to care about you, though that's nice, and one might want to have that liberal culture, but that's not, there's a limit in human experience where there is no empathy, where there's something alien, and that is very important, not to have that echo. Maybe this also, I don't want everything to echo and tie together, but it may have to do with that initial question I asked you about refusing the envisionment, refusing the closure of the reading. What does it mean? You see these features, because that closes the echo into something that shuts you out. It makes it a sealed thing. Whereas the inscrutability, the difficulty, is something that one can live with. And also, I would say the beauty of aesthetics and the pleasure of poetry is that is what it doesn't echo, what stands out like a sore thumb, that you bang your head against, that the rhythms are not perfect, and that living with those things aesthetically. This could also have a political allegory, but I don't want to allegorize it politically. But it's hard not to when I speak, but I want to have an experience anyway, where you constantly have the echo or rhythm stopped. And I think this also does relate to Atkins. Why Atkins is very he doesn't it's a spiritual, it doesn't have quite the, it flattens it out. It brings up the materiality of the rain, because the rain, it's scary. I mean, it's a flood. It's over your head. It's Katrina times 100. And I think that the recognizing of that is, and the fire next time not said, it's a very haunting. That it's flat makes it even more haunting. So
we do have two questions.
Two questions, okay.
Both related to the Atkins poem. So I'll just read them both. I wonder if either of you could say more about the relationship between materiality and cultural context. Craig seemed to suggest that these were interconnected in the case of spiritual, and I'd be curious to hear more about it. And then we have another question. Atkins being passed around Cleveland in a typed version is one context filled with a community. How does the contemporary context of poems being passed around on the internet filter into the poem? In other words, how do you read that context into the poem?
Okay, so that's Matthew Johnson and then Bill Griza. Yeah, okay, thank you both. And Bill, if I'm not wrong, is in Cincinnati, which is of course also in Ohio. Because the thing about it, I don't know much about Atkins apart from what I now have read in the books that Craig sent handed, but he pretty much he was very local to Cleveland, and didn't travel outside Cleveland much with him. I certainly didn't know about him until recently. Craig,
I mean, Cleveland is part of the particular connection in that moment in this mid '60s summer where the Huff neighborhood was in mass protest and took the form, particularly there, of targeted arson. So the fire this time was all to the point. Something that changes when it's read in a different community, in a different context, certainly different when it's published as part of a collection of Cleveland concrete poets or visual poets. And on the internet, part of what this goes back to, I think, to echo and allusion and quotation. It turns out that it's almost impossible to quote quotation marks because of the kinds of technologies involved. And there's a long, if anyone wants to really geek out on, ASCII coding, I have a long footnote about the politics behind the very broad but ultimately limited space that we have for character encoding to make text legible to humans on the internet. And the Greek government is fighting the Mormon Church for space for special alphabets, and so there's real territorial colonization of the spaces we have for quotation marks. Are they curved? Are they representing diacritics? Are they representing breathing marks? What are these little marks doing? And so there's one problem that happens when things circulate.
I mean, it could be, and I guess we'll stop with this comment. It could be that that those marks, which I would read potentially as rain, except didn't take away from the materiality. You say this in your piece, but they also could be quote marks. I mean, I believe that you do say that too. So you could see the kind of reading that, having read Craig's analysis, it already opens up to me the way I'm thinking about it, and the interplay, in a sense, between the quote mark and the possible rain mark is, or just the mark on the page. This is one of Michael Fried's big things, the mark on the page, just the mark on the page for the visual arts. He doesn't see that in poetry, but I think it's equally significant in poetry. To Bill's larger question, I think it's so worthwhile to end with that. Because, I mean, for one thing, here we are. Bill, I can see you. You're not speaking. You're in Cincinnati now? Is that right? Yeah.
Chicago.
What?
Chicago.
Chicago. Oh, you're Chicago. I'm sorry, because I associate. Well, anyway, okay. Good to see you though. So that's good. Chicago. So you're in the same city, all the better with Meredith and our publisher. It's because the last time I saw you, you were with somebody from Cincinnati, Ariel. You did an event, a Zoom event. But I think that speaks to the issue, the displacement that we have. I think you should probably turn your video off for the second, because now you're Bill, turn your video off if you can. Yeah. Oh, but he's still. I think that where we are, it gets very confused in the Zoom environment, which I find troubling in some way, in many ways. Creates us, just like I'm seeing this now on my screen, is these little boxes that are separated. I think that the Zoom is actually more alienating and isolating, of course, than a local context. But still, and this would be why I think I want to write that poem about the West Lake in China and being with my Chinese friends. I mean, the struggle is always between the local and the particular and something outside of it, which is not universal, because I don't think there is a universal, but bringing into conjunction, into constellation, particulars without destroying the particular, but without denying the fact that these new constellations emerge. So I think the task for us as publishers, the University of Chicago Press, as readers, and as poets is to constantly move toward an articulation of the echoes and the constellations, and not think that we're nowhere, but also not think that we're in any one place. So thanks so much for joining us. And Craig, what wonderful to talk to you. It always is.
Charles, it's such an honor to get to do this with you. It's good to see you.
Thanks so much to you both, and thanks everyone for joining us.